They told me I had 30 days. 30 days to lose the farmhouse my family built in 1901. 30 days to walk away from the porch where my great-grandfather carved his initials into the railing. 30 days to watch a century of memory get erased by a piece of paper slid across a polished conference table. And the reason they gave me was almost laughable, if it hadn't been so serious. Unpaid HOA fees, rules I never agreed to, penalties I'd never been notified about. I remember staring at the letter, reading it again and again, waiting for the punchline that never came. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it was pressing the air out of my chest. Outside the window, the fields were quiet. Late afternoon light rolled across the pasture the same way it had every day of my life. Chickens scratched in the dirt. The old barn creaked in the breeze. Everything looked normal. But according to that letter, none of it was mine anymore. They said foreclosure like it was a scheduling issue, like losing your home was just another checkbox on a clipboard. I was told the farm was now non-compliant, that it existed within the jurisdiction of the Hartwell Meadows Homeowners Association, that failure to pay retroactive fees would result in legal action. Retroactive, as in they claimed I owed money for years before I'd ever heard their name. My hands actually shook when I turned the page. There was a total printed neatly at the bottom. Tens of thousands of dollars, fees, fines, assessments, late penalties, interest, all stacked on top of each other like bricks meant to bury me. I'd lived on this land my entire life. My father had lived here, his father before him. The farmhouse predated indoor plumbing, paved roads, and zoning laws by decades. There had never been an HOA here, not until a few years ago, when bulldozers showed up at the edge of the property and started carving the fields into perfect little rectangles. At first, I didn't worry. Developments come and go. The farm had always been here. It would outlast another one. I was wrong. What I didn't understand, what none of us understood at the time, was that this wasn't about grass height or mailbox color or some petty rule violation. This was about leverage, and once they thought they had it, they didn't bother hiding how confident they were. The HOA president herself came to the farm the next morning. She didn't park in the driveway. She stopped her SUV right at the edge of the property, like she was afraid the dirt might stain her tires. She stepped out wearing sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, holding a leather folder tucked under her arm like a weapon. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "You've received the notice." Not a question. A statement. I told her I had. I asked her to explain how land that had been in my family for over 100 years suddenly belonged to an HOA that didn't even exist until recently. She smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind you give someone when you think you've already won. Development changes things, she said. You're surrounded now. That makes you part of the community. I told her I never signed anything. She shrugged. You benefit from our infrastructure. I looked around. The road I drove on every day had been laid by the county in the 1950s. The water came from our well. The power lines had been there longer than her subdivision. What infrastructure? I asked. She flipped open the folder and tapped a page with a manicured fingernail. The rules are very clear. That was the moment I realized she wasn't here to talk. She was here to inform me, she explained, slowly, patiently, like she was talking to a child, that if I paid what I owed, this could all go away. If I didn't, the HOA would enforce its rights. Liens, legal action, foreclosure. I asked how an HOA could foreclose on property it didn't own. She took off her sunglasses then, finally meeting my eyes. We work with your lender, she said. They're very cooperative. That was the first real chill, because I didn't have a lender. The farm had been paid off before I was born. I told her that. She didn't even blink. That's not what our records show. She handed me another document. According to that paper, there was an outstanding obligation tied to the property. According to that paper, the HOA had every right to collect. I told her the document was wrong. She smiled again. Then you should prove it. You have 30 days. And just like that, she turned and walked back to her SUV, heels sinking slightly into the dirt, like the land itself was rejecting her. I stood there long after she left, staring at tire tracks cutting across the edge of the field. I could still hear her voice in my head, calm, certain, confident. People like that don't bluff. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my great-grandfather, who'd bought this land when it was nothing but raw acreage and stubborn dreams. About my grandmother teaching me to plant tomatoes behind the house. About my father fixing the roof by hand because this place takes care of us if we take care of it. I thought about how easily it could all be taken away, all because someone decided my home was in the way of their view. The next few days were a blur of letters, emails, and phone calls. The HOA sent notices stamped with legal language designed to intimidate. Neighbors I barely knew started avoiding eye contact. Rumors spread fast, people whispering that my farm was bringing down property values, that it was out of compliance, that it was only a matter of time. Every message ended the same way: pay up or lose everything. What bothered me most wasn't the money, it was the assumption. They assumed I didn't know the law. They assumed I didn't understand finance. They assumed I was just a stubborn farmer, clinging to land I couldn't protect. They assumed wrong. But at that point they didn't know that. And I didn't correct them. Instead, I did what I've always done when something doesn't make sense. I started reading every document they sent, every line, every clause, every date. I noticed things that didn't add up. References to boundary changes I'd never seen, claims about agreements that didn't exist, fees dated years before the HOA was even formed. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate. Someone had decided my farm was worth more to them than to me, and they were willing to push as hard as it took to get it. A week later, I got another call. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a bank. They were polite, professional, concerned. They wanted to discuss my options. That's when the puzzle pieces finally started clicking into place. The HOA hadn't just threatened me, they'd already set things in motion. They believed they had the bank on their side. They believed the system would roll forward exactly the way it always did, quietly, efficiently, without resistance. They believed foreclosure was inevitable. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the letter they sent, the bank they contacted, the process they triggered, all of it ran straight through me. They saw a farmhouse. They saw a farmer. They saw an obstacle they could remove. What they didn't see was the irony unfolding right under their feet. Because the moment they tried to use the bank against me was the moment they stepped onto ground they didn't own. And they were about to learn, far too late, that threatening my home meant waking up the one person who understood exactly how their entire system worked. What they didn't know was who actually owned their bank. Before any of this happened, life was simple in a way most people don't believe anymore. I woke up to the same sound every morning, the wind moving through the trees behind the house and the soft creak of the barn as the boards warmed in the sun. No traffic, no sirens, just birds arguing over fence posts and the distant lowing of cattle from the neighboring pasture. The farmhouse sat on 40 acres that had been in my family since 1901, long before paved roads or zoning maps or neighborhood associations existed. My great-grandfather bought the land with money he earned hauling timber by mule. He built the house himself, cutting the beams by hand and fitting every joint like he was building something meant to last forever. And he did. The front porch still had the marks from where he carved his initials into the wood. My grandmother used to tell me he did that, so the house would always remember who started it. When I was a kid, she'd sit in the rocking chair out there with a glass of sweet tea and tell me stories about winters so cold the pump froze solid, and summers so hot the corn wilted before noon. She said the land taught them patience, taught them humility, taught them that nothing good came fast. My father inherited the farm after she passed. He never wanted to sell it, never wanted to modernize it too much either. You don't fix what isn't broken, he used to say. He kept the fields planted, kept the fences mended, kept the place alive. When he got sick, I moved back to help him. By the time he was gone, the farm felt less like property and more like a responsibility. I stayed. I didn't have to. I could have sold it for a good price even then. Developers had sniffed around before. But I liked the quiet. I liked knowing where everything came from. I liked walking the same ground my family had walked for over 100 years. My day had a rhythm. Feed the chickens, check the fence line, walk the field edge with a mug of coffee while the mist lifted off the grass, fix whatever broke, plant in spring, harvest in fall, sit on the porch at night and watch the sky change colors like it had been doing long before I ever showed up. The land didn't rush me, it didn't demand. It just existed. For most of my life, the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. You could stand at the end of my driveway and see nothing but open land in 3 directions. That changed one summer when the survey flags appeared. At first it didn't bother me. Flags come and go. Then came the machines, yellow metal monsters chewing into the fields beyond my fence line. Trees disappeared, dirt moved, roads appeared where there had only been grass. The development grew fast, like something artificial that didn't belong to the soil it sat on. They called it Hartwell Meadows. It had gates. It had stone signs with engraved lettering. It had houses lined up in perfect rows like soldiers, roofs all the same color, lawns cut to identical heights, mailboxes that matched. It was impressive in a way, but it didn't feel real. From my porch, I could see the back ends of those houses. I could hear their lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, their dogs barking at nothing, their music drifting over the fields at night. They were close enough now that when the wind shifted, I could smell their grills instead of my own wood smoke. Still, I didn't complain. They had their world. I had mine. At first, they didn't pay much attention to me either. I was just the old farmhouse at the edge of their view, something different, something that didn't quit. Fit their picture of what the neighborhood should look like. That changed when the HOA showed up. They didn't start with me. They started with their own people. Lawn violations, fence colors, trash cans left out too long. It was all small stuff, but it set the tone. The association ran like a business. Committees, meetings, newsletters, rules printed in glossy booklets. I saw their president once, standing at the entrance sign with a clipboard, inspecting flower beds like a general reviewing troops. She always looked like she was in charge of something important. Expensive clothes, perfect posture, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They were new money, that OA, new power, new sense of importance, and they hated disorder. They hated anything that didn't fit into neat lines and approved lists. My farm didn't fit. I noticed it first with the looks. People standing on their decks staring toward my fields. I noticed it when someone complained about the smell of manure, when a woman asked me if I planned to modernize the barn because it was kind of an eyesore. I noticed it when a man suggested I should trim the trees because they blocked sunset views from his second story. They didn't say it directly, but I knew what they were thinking. My land was in the way. Their neighborhood was built to look perfect from every angle, and the farmhouse didn't match the brochure. It was weathered, honest, old. The paint wasn't new. The barn leaned a little to the left. The fence posts were uneven because my father had replaced them over decades instead of all at once. It told a story. They didn't like that. The HOA grew bolder over time. They put up signs about RTI standards. They sent notices to residents about adjacent land use concerns. They talked about harmony and community and shared responsibility, but it always came back to control. They were wealthy. You could tell by the cars in their driveways and the way they talked about things like investment value and resale potential. They saw the land as numbers, assets, something to be optimized. I saw it as home. My grandparents were buried less than a mile away. My father's ashes were spread in the north field under the oak tree he loved. Every fence line had a memory attached to it. Every scratch on the doorframe marked a year I'd grown taller. Every creak in the floorboard had its own sound, like the house was speaking a language only I understood. The HOA didn't care about any of that. To them, history was inconvenient. What they wanted was uniformity, order, a view that didn't include a barn or a chicken coop. They wanted their development to look like it had always been there, even though it was brand new. For a while it stayed quiet, tense but quiet. No official contact, just sideways glances and muttered comments at the edge of the fence. I thought that was as bad as it would get. I was wrong. One afternoon, I came back from town and found a white envelope stuck in my mailbox. It had an official logo in the corner and bold print across the front. I didn't open it right away. I carried it into the house and set it on the table like it might bite me. I made coffee. I sat down. I stared at it. It felt out of place in a house where most mail was feed catalogs and utility bills. This envelope looked like it belonged somewhere else, in an office, in a Why? Somewhere with cubicles and carpet. When I finally tore it open, I expected a complaint, a warning, maybe a request. What I got was a demand. It said my property was now subject to HOA regulations, that I owed fees, that I was in violation, that action would be taken if I failed to comply. I read it 3 times. I laughed once, out loud, because it didn't make sense. Then the second page made it worse. They had dates, amounts, clauses, a total at the bottom like a receipt for something I never bought. My heart started to pound. Not from fear at first, but from disbelief. It was like someone had walked into my house and declared it wasn't mine anymore. I stepped outside and looked at the fields, the barn, the trees. Nothing had changed, but according to that letter, everything had. I thought about my grandmother on the porch, about my father fixing the roof, about my great-grandfather carving his name into the wood, and for the first time in my life, I felt like something solid was suddenly fragile. The HOA was new, wealthy, confident, obsessed with order. My farm was old, quiet, unbothered by trends. Those 2 things were never going to coexist. I folded the letter slowly and set it back on the table. Then one letter changed everything. The next letter came 3 days later. Not in an envelope this time. It was taped to my front door like a warning notice on an abandoned building. Thick paper, bold print, legal language meant to look official enough to scare people into obedience without them asking too many questions. I read it standing in the doorway, the screen door creaking behind me. It said I was in violation of HOA standards. Not one violati. On several. My fence was non-compliant. My barn was an unauthorized structure. My driveway was improperly surfaced. My livestock created nuisance conditions. And the fees were something else entirely. They claimed I owed 5 years of HOA dues, 5 years of fines, 5 years of penalties, interest included. According to them, I had been breaking their rules long before I even knew they existed. I sat down at the kitchen table and spread the papers out like a deck of bad cards. There were maps showing new boundary lines that cut straight through my field, placing my farmhouse neatly inside their jurisdiction. There were references to agreements I had never signed. There were pages of regulations that somehow applied to buildings older than the town itself. They weren't tasking anymore. They were declaring. By the end of the week, I'd received 3 more notices, each one worse than the last, each one using stronger language. The tone shifted from polite to firm to threatening. Failure to comply, failure to remit payment, failure to acknowledge authority, and then came the number. The total they said I owed could have bought a small house outright. They wanted it paid immediately, or they would pursue remedies available under law. I called the number on the letter. A woman answered, cheerful and sharp, like she was used to people being nervous. I told her there had been a mistake. She laughed, not kindly. Sir, she said, this isn't a mistake. Your property is part of Hartwell Meadows. I told her my farm had been there since 1901. She said, development changes things. I told her I never joined an HOA. She said, you don't have to join to benefit. I asked her what exactly I was benefiting from. She paused, just long enough for it to feel deliberate. Property value stability, she said. I said I didn't care about that. She said, you will when it's gone. 2 days later, the HOA president showed up again. This time, she brought someone with her, a man in a suit carrying a leather briefcase. He didn't look at the farm. He didn't look at the barn. He barely looked at me. He just stood there like a prop while she did the talking. She walked right up to the porch and held out a folder. Here are the updated violations, she said. I didn't take it. She sighed, like I was wasting her time. We really don't want to escalate this. I asked her what escalation looked like. She smiled again. That same confident, polished smile. Liens, she said. legal action, foreclosure. The word landed like a hammer. I told her she couldn't foreclose on land that wasn't part of her HOA. She opened the folder and pulled out a map. "This," she said, tapping it with her finger, "is the revised boundary agreement from 2010. I told her I'd never seen it. She said, "You don't have to remember it for it to be valid." I asked who signed it. She said, "The prior landowner." I said that was my father, and he died in 2008. She didn't miss a beat. Then it was likely handled by his estate. She had an answer for everything. I told her I wanted proof. She closed the folder slowly and looked at me like I'd just disappointed her. "You've already been given proof," she said. "What you want is a way out." The man with the briefcase finally spoke. "If you refuse to comply," he said, "the HOA will enforce its rights." I asked him whose rights. He said, "The community's." I looked past them at the rows of identical houses in the distance. Curtains moved. Someone was watching. The president lowered her voice. "You're hurting your neighbors," she said. "Your farm is dragging down their values. You're creating health concerns. You're refusing to be reasonable." I told her this land fed my family for generations. She said, "It's time to move on." I told her I wasn't selling. She said, "You won't have to." That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about force. Over the next 2 weeks, the violations multiplied. They added fees for weeds that didn't exist. They fined me for noise from animals at dawn. They accused me of dumping waste. They cited me for building codes written decades after my barn was built. Every notice referenced the same thing. Failure to comply would result in foreclosure. Neighbors started whispering that I was going to lose the farm, that the HOA was finally doing something about it, that maybe the land would be turned into a park or another row of houses. One afternoon, a man from the HOA came with a clipboard and tried to step past my fence. I told him to leave. He said he was there to inspect. I said he didn't have permission. He said he didn't need it. That was when I felt something shift inside me, not fear, anger. I went down to the HOA office myself. It was inside a brand new building with glass doors and fake plants. The lobby smelled like cleaner and fresh carpet. A plaque on the wall listed board members' names in gold letters. I asked to see the president. She made me wait. When she finally came, she didn't offer a seat. She leaned against the desk like she was bored. "You still haven't paid," she said. I told her again that I didn't owe her anything. She laughed softly. "You farmers," she said, "you always think land means independence." I asked her how she planned to take it. She turned her computer screen toward me. There was my property address. Under it, foreclosure pending. She had already filed. "You can avoid all this," she said. "Just sign the compliance agreement and pay what you owe." I asked her how much she wanted. She gave me the number. It was higher than before. I asked her what would happen if I didn't. She leaned closer. "We work with your bank," she said. "They're very helpful." I told her I didn't have a mortgage. She tilted her head. "According to them," she said, "you do." That was when the mocking started. She called my farm obsolete. She called my barn a hazard. She called my refusal childish. "You're standing in the way of progress," she said, "and progress always wins." I left without another word. That night, I spread every document across the table again. The fees, the maps, the violations, the threats. None of it was random. It was built to overwhelm. They wanted me tired, confused, afraid. They wanted me to give up. They wanted me to believe they had already won. I realized something then. They thought I was just a farmer. They thought I didn't know how banks worked. They thought I didn't understand contracts. They thought I wouldn't question forged boundaries and invented debts. They thought pressure would break me, but pressure doesn't always break things. Sometimes it reveals them, and the more they pushed, the clearer it became they were hiding something. The documents were too clean, the story too rehearsed, the confidence too rehearsed. They weren't enforcing rules, they were creating them. I looked at the foreclosure notice again, the bank name at the bottom, the process they were using to try to take my home. They believed the system was on their side. They believed I didn't belong in that world. They believed I was powerless. That's when I decided to stop pretending I was just a farmer. I didn't tell anyone what I was about to do. Not the neighbors, not the HOA, not even the people who still thought of me as the quiet man on the old farm. On the outside, I kept acting exactly the same. I fed the chickens. I fixed a loose fence board. I walked the fields in the morning like nothing had changed. When HOA notices came, I stacked them neatly in a drawer. When their office called, I let it go to voicemail. When neighbors asked what I was going to do, I shrugged and said I was looking into it. What the first didn't say was that I already knew where to look, because before I ever came back to this farm, before I ever wore boots every day and smelled like hay and dust, I'd lived a very different life. I used to work in finance, not as a teller, not as an advisor, not as someone selling credit cards in a branch lobby. I worked in the part of the system most people never see, the part that decides what gets approved and what gets buried, the part that knows exactly how foreclosure really works when you strip away the legal language and polite letters. I knew what a legitimate lien looked like. I knew how a bank verified a debt. I knew the defer, NCE between paperwork that was messy and paperwork that was manufactured. And what the HOA sent me didn't look messy. It looked staged. So instead of hiring a lawyer right away or going to court shouting fraud, I did the one thing they didn't expect. I went quiet. I started with their threat, foreclosure. That word scares people because it sounds final, like a hammer coming down. But foreclosure isn't magic. It's a process, a chain of steps, one document triggering another, one department relying on information from someone else, and every step leaves a trail. I drove into town the next morning and parked across the street from the bank listed on the notice. I didn't march in like I was angry. I didn't demand anything. I put on an old jacket and walked in like someone who didn't know what he was doing. There was a line at the counter, people depositing checks, asking about balances, normal things. When it was my turn, I asked the woman behind the desk if I could speak to someone about a foreclosure notice. Her smile tightened. She handed me a number and pointed to a chair. I waited. When my number was called, I followed a loan officer into a small office with a desk, 2 chairs, and a framed poster about financial responsibility. She asked for my address. I gave it to her. She typed for a moment, then frowned. "Yes," she said, "there's an active file." I asked her how that was possible. She said the HOA had submitted documentation showing unpaid obligations tied to the property. I asked her if the bank had verified that. She hesitated. "We received certified documents." I asked her if the bank had ever sent me a bill. She checked. "No." Cared her if I'd ever signed a loan. She checked again. "No." I asked her why foreclosure was pending if there was no loan. Her answer was careful. "It's based on the association's claim." That was the moment I knew. They weren't using the bank. They were using the bank's fear. Banks don't like risk. They don't like uncertainty. They especially don't like complaints from organizations claiming legal authority. If an HOA submits something that looks official, many banks will move first and ask questions later, and that's exactly what was happening. The HOA had given them maps. They'd given them statements. They'd given them numbers. What they hadn't given them was truth. I didn't correct the loan officer. I didn't accuse anyone. I thanked her and left. Over the next week, I went back twice more. Each time I asked different questions. Each time I learned a little more. The bank believed the HOA's documents. The bank had not seen originals. The bank had not contacted me before moving forward. The bank assumed the HOA's authority was real. That told me something important. The HOA didn't own the process. They were feeding it, and feeding it badly. At home, I laid everything out again. Their maps next to county records, their dates next to incorporation filings, their boundary lines next to survey lines that hadn't changed in a century. Nothing matched, and the more I looked, the clearer it became the HOA hadn't just stretched the truth. They'd rewritten it. They'd taken advantage of the fact that most people don't know how land law works, or how banking compliance works, or how easily something false can become dangerous once it enters the system. I could have walked straight into a lawyer's office and handed them everything. I didn't, not yet, because something else was bothering me. The HOA president's confidence. She wasn't bluffing, she wasn't guessing, she wasn't acting like someone hoping intimidation would work. She was acting like someone who knew exactly what was going to happen. And that meant she believed the bank would follow through, which meant she believed the bank was already on her side. So I stopped asking what the HOA wanted and started asking why the bank was listening. I requested public filings. I pulled development records. I looked at financing statements for the subdivision. That's when I saw it. The development hadn't been built with cash. It hadn't been built slowly. It had been built on loans, big ones. The HOA president wasn't just a board member. She was tied to the development company, and that company owed money, a lot of money, to the same bank that now had a foreclosure notice on my property. The pattern started forming. She wasn't just trying to take my farm. She was trying to cover something. If she could absorb my land into the HOA, she could use it as collateral. If she could push me out, she could sell it. If she could show growth, she could justify more borrowing. And if she could make the bank think I owed them something, then the bank wouldn't look too closely at what she owed them. That's when I stopped playing defense. But I didn't go public. I didn't confront her. I didn't tip my hand. I just kept digging, quietly. I knew how foreclosures were processed. I knew which departments saw which documents. I knew what questions should have been as cared and which ones weren't. The HOA assumed I'd panic. They assumed I'd beg. They assumed I'd sell. They didn't assume I'd audit their story. I went back to the bank one more time and asked a different question. I asked who had authorized the file. The answer was a name I didn't recognize, WR. I asked who had approved the HOA's documents. Another name, B. I asked how many loans the development had. The loan officer looked uncomfortable. BR. Several, she said. I thanked her and left. BR outside, the sun was bright. Cars passed. People went about their day. No one knew that a house built in 1901 was being targeted by paperwork built last month. The HOA thought they had found a weak point, BR. They thought a farmhouse with no mortgage was easy to take. They thought an old man on old land wouldn't understand a modern system. What they didn't realize was that their plan depended on a bank doing exactly what they wanted. And the more I learned, the more obvious it became. They hadn't just chosen the wrong target, they had chosen the wrong path. Because everything they were using to threaten me, BR ran through a system I knew better than they ever would. The HOA had made one fatal mistake. They picked the wrong bank. I didn't expect to find corruption so quickly. At first I thought I'd uncover sloppy paperwork, maybe a boundary error, maybe an overeager HOA board member who didn't understand where their authority ended, something fixable, something small. What I found instead was a pattern, .dr, and patterns don't happen by accident, .br. The maps were the first clue. The HOA's version of my property line showed my farmhouse neatly tucked inside their development boundary. The company, Auntie's version, still showed the same line it had for over a century. The two didn't even try to agree. One was drawn like a ruler had been laid across the land. The other followed natural features, tree lines, creeks, old fence posts. One was real, the other was convenient. I brought copies to the county clerk and asked a simple question. Had there ever been a boundary revision filed for my land? She searched the system and shook her head. Nothing on record, she said. Last survey was from the 1940s. But the HOA's document claimed a change in 2010. That meant only one thing. It was made up. The signature on the form didn't match my father's handwriting. The notary stamp belonged to someone who'd retired years before the date printed on the page. Even the formatting was wrong. Different margins, different spacing, different font from every legitimate filing I could find. It wasn't sloppy. It was forged. I should have gone straight to the police then. But something told me this wasn't just about one document, so I kept looking. I compared HOA meeting minutes with the dates on their claims, fees approved after they were supposedly owed, rules written years after they were enforced, retroactive authority that didn't exist in law but existed very clearly on paper. They were creating history, writing a past that suited them, and the bank had accepted it. That bothered me more than the HOA itself, because HOAs lie, Banks are supposed to verify, so I dug into how the foreclosure process had started. The bank hadn't received a complaint from me, they hadn't sent me a bill, they hadn't called, they had received a certified obligation package F from the HOA. Inside it were statements of debt, maps of jurisdiction, affidavits of authority, all stamped, all formatted, all professional looking, and all false. The HOA hadn't gone to court. They'd gone straight to the lender. They hadn't tried to win legally. They'd tried to win administratively. It was faster, quieter, and if no one objected, it would work. Then something else happened. Mrs. Kowalski knocked on my door. She lived 3 houses into the subdivision. Small woman, always wore a sweater even when it was warm. She looked nervous standing on my porch like she was afraid someone might see her. "I shouldn't be here," she said. I told her to come in. She sat at the kitchen table and pulled out an envelope from her purse. "They came to me," she said. "The HOA board." She slid the papers across to me. They were forms, complaint forms, statements about health hazards from my animals, about odor violations, about noise disturbances. She hadn't signed them. "They wanted me to," she said. "They said if I didn't, my fees would go up." My stomach tightened. "They offered to cover 2 years of my HOA dues," she added. "If I said your farm was a problem, that's when it crossed the line. It wasn't enforcement anymore. It was coercion." Over the next few days I heard similar stories, not directly but through sideways conversations. A man who suddenly got a violation dismissed after complaining about my barn. A family whose late fees vanished after writing a letter about agricultural concerns. People who suddenly had incentives to lie. The HOA wasn't just inventing rules. They were buying witnesses, and they were scared. You don't pressure people unless you're desperate. I pulled the development's financial records next. Public filings showed the company behind Hartwell Meadows had taken out multiple large loans. The timing lined up with the HOA's sudden aggression. Each loan was backed by rising property values. Each one depended on the neighborhood appearing clean, controlled, and expanding. My farm didn't fit that image. Worse than that, my land sat right between 2 major expansion phases. They needed it. If they could absorb it into the HOA, they could count it as part of the development. If they could push me out, they could sell it. If they could sell it, they could cover their debts. The pressure campaign made sense now. They weren't enforcing order, they were running out of money. I requested copies of the loans tied to the development through public channels. What I saw made my jaw tighten. Inflated appraisals, projected values that assumed my land was already theirs, maps that quietly erased my property line. The HOA president had been using future land as present collateral. That was fraud. The bank hadn't noticed because the documents looked official, and because nobody expects an HOA president to lie about maps. But then came the worst part, emails. A former HOA board member reached out anonymously, slipped a folder under my door one night. Inside were printed emails between the HOA president and someone at the bank. Not executives, loan officers, fast approvals. "Don't worry about verification. We'll clean up the paper. Work later." That wasn't incompetence. That was collusion. I read them 3 times. They weren't explicit, but they didn't have to be. It was clear they were coordinating timelines, clear they were moving fast because someone needed money soon. The HOA president wasn't just arrogant. She was cornered. And when people like that get cornered, they don't back off. They escalate. The next violation notice accused me of dumping waste into groundwater. The next one accused me of unsafe structures. The next one warned of emergency foreclosure action. Neighbors started getting letters saying their mortgages could be affected if property values dropped, that their homes could be at risk because of my farm. That was when fear spread. People stopped waving, stopped walking near my fence, stopped talking. The HOA wasn't just attacking me anymore. They were using me as a threat. I felt the weight of it every time I stepped outside, like I was suddenly radioactive, like the land itself had become dangerous just by existing, and still they pushed another boundary claim, another fee increase, another foreclosure warning. They were trying to move faster than the truth, but lies stack up badly. Every new document contradicted the last, every new rule exposed an old fake, every new threat made their story thinner. It was like watching someone build a house out of paper and insisting it was concrete. I sat at the table one night with everything spread out. Maps, emails, forms, notices, loan records. It looked less like a dispute and more like a crime scene. Forgery, coercion, manipulated lending, false claims, threats. This wasn't about order. It wasn't taboo. Harmony. It wasn't about community. It was about covering debt. It was about hiding losses. It was about squeezing value out of land that didn't belong to them. And that's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about money. I had been holding back the truth for weeks. Not because I was afraid to say it, because once it was said, everything would change. Up until then, the HOA believed they were dealing with a stubborn farmer who didn't understand how the modern world worked. They believed I was standing alone against an organization with lawyers, money, and influence. They believed their foreclosure threat would eventually scare me into selling or signing. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to check, was who had been watching them from the other side of the paperwork. Years before I came back to this farm for good, I'd spent my life in finance. Not as a face on a billboard, not as a guy in a branch office handing out pens. I worked quietly, buying into struggling regional banks when no one else wanted them. Community banks, the kind that handled local mortgages and development loans, the kind that didn't make headlines. One of those banks was the same one listed at the bottom of my foreclosure notice. And I didn't just have an account there. I owned it. Not my name on the sign, not my face on the website, but a controlling interest through a holding company I'd built years earlier. The kind of ownership that doesn't show up in small-town gossip, but absolutely shows up in boardrooms and regulatory filings. The bank that the HOA trusted, the bank they'd used to finance their development, the bank they believed would carry out my foreclosure was mine. They sent my foreclosure to the one bank they never should have used. The moment I realized that, the entire story flipped. Every fake document they'd submitted, every loan they'd inflated, every boundary they'd forged. It hadn't gone into a neutral system. It had gone straight into one I controlled. I didn't walk into the bank and announce it. I didn't confront the HOA. I didn't send threats. I called a closed-door meeting, not with tellers, not with loan officers, with executives. People who knew exactly what federal audits meant. People who understood what happened when regulators discovered that a bank had processed fraudulent foreclosure paperwork. I brought the file, not a summary, not a complaint. The whole thing, forged boundary maps next to real ones, fake HOA claims next to county records, emails showing coordination, loan documents showing inflated collateral, violation notices that contradicted incorporation dates. I laid them out on the table one by one. No yelling, no anger, just facts. When I told them I was the majority shareholder, the room went silent. Not shock, fear, because they understood immediately what it meant. It meant this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a federal banking problem. The foreclosure was frozen that same day. No letter, no explanation to the HOA, just stopped. The system they thought was about to crush me, locked up instead. Then the questions started. Who approved this file? Why wasn't the debt verified? Why did the HOA have custody of original documents? Why were boundary changes accepted without county confirmation? There were no good answers, so I didn't stop at freezing the foreclosure. I sent the entire package to the regulators, not as revenge, as evidence. When the federal investigators showed up, they didn't announce themselves. They asked for records, they asked for logs, they asked for correspondence. They didn't care about HOA rules or neighbor complaints, they cared about fraud. And what they found made the HOA's paperwork look like a child's attempt at forgery. Their loans were tied to projections that assumed my land already belonged to them. Their appraisals included acreage they didn't own. Their HOA authority claims were never legally filed. Their foreclosure attempt relied on fabricated debt. The bank's own employees were questioned. Some admitted they'd trusted the HOA president's word. Some admitted they'd skipped verification because the documents looked official. That wasn't malicious, but it was illegal, and it didn't stop with the bank. The HOA president was summoned. She came in confident. She always did, until she realized this wasn't a board meeting. It was an investigation. Her boundary maps didn't match county records. Her HOA claims didn't match state law. Her financial statements didn't match her debts. And then the loans were examined. That's when everything collapsed. Her development company had been using imaginary property as collateral. Her HOA had been acting as a pressure arm to seize land. Her foreclosure threat wasn't about rules. It was about plugging a hole in her balance sheet. When her accounts were frozen, the HOA lost its funding. When the loans were flagged, the development halted. When the documents were seized, the board resigned. The same woman who had stood on my porch telling me progress always wins suddenly couldn't make payroll for her own association. Law enforcement didn't knock. They walked in. Fraud, forgery, coercion, false filings, bank manipulation. The charges weren't about grass height or barn paint. They were about money. And the HOA collapsed the way paper does when it gets wet. Meetings cancelled, emails unanswered, signs taken down, the office emptied. Neighbors who had been afraid started asking questions. People who had written complaints admitted they'd been pressured. People who had paid fees asked where the money went. And the truth came out. The HOA had been using intimidation to inflate value, using fear to enforce silence, using fake authority to cover real debt. They had tried to take my farm. Instead, they exposed themselves. The foreclosure never key. AMA. Instead, a different kind of notice did. One explaining that the HOA no longer had legal standing, that its claims against my land were void, that its financial practices were under review. I walked back onto my porch that evening and sat in the same chair my grandmother once used. The fields looked the same. The barn leaned the same way. The wind moved through the trees like it always had. Nothing about the land had changed, only the story around it. They thought they could use the bank as a weapon. They thought the system was on their side. They thought they were dealing with someone who didn't belong in their world. They were wrong, because when they tried to take my home, they ran headfirst into the one person who knew exactly how their entire machine worked, and the machine broke. When it was finally over, it didn't end with sirens or shouting. It ended quietly. The HOA sign at the entrance of the neighborhood came down one morning. No announcement, no meeting, just a pickup truck, a ladder, and a man unbolting metal letters that had once looked permanent. By noon, there was nothing left but 2 holes in the brick where the logo used to be. That was how people knew it was really done. The board dissolved within weeks. The accounts were frozen, then audited, then emptied into escrow while investigators sorted out what had gone where. The president, who used to walk the streets with her clipboard and her smug little smile, stopped showing up altogether. Her emails bounced. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Eventually, word spread that she wasn't just stepping down. She was being questioned somewhere far from here. The new HOA, if you could even see all it that, wasn't an HOA in the old sense. It became a neighborhood council. No fines, no threats, no we own you now energy. Just people managing shared roads and trash schedules and holiday lights like neighbors are supposed to. And the foreclosure? Gone. Not delayed, not appealed, erased. The bank issued a statement saying there was no valid claim against my land. The county reaffirmed the original boundary line that had existed since my grandfather was a boy. The fake maps were voided. The fake fees disappeared. The fake authority evaporated. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. The neighbors came back slowly. At first it was cautious, a wave from across the street, a nod when I passed. A woman walking her dog along my fence again like she used to before she was afraid of getting written up. Then one Saturday, a couple showed up with a pie. Not an apology, not an explanation, just pie. We didn't know what was true, they said. They said you were dangerous to property values. I laughed, because the idea of my crooked barn being dangerous to anything except pigeons was ridiculous. After that, people started talking. The man who had filed noise complaints admitted the HOA told him he'd lose his parking space if he didn't. The woman who wrote about odors admitted they offered to waive her back dues. A teenager who had taken pictures of my fences said they paid him $50 to document violations. Fear had made liars out of good people, and relief made them honest again. The farmhouse stayed exactly the way it was. The same chipped paint on the porch railing, the same loose board by the back steps, the same wind through the apple trees that had been there longer than any subdivision. But it felt different, like the land itself could breathe again. The silence changed too. Before, it had been tense, like the pause before a storm. After, it was the good kind, the kind that comes after an argument is finally over. Kids started cutting through my back field again on their bikes. One of the families asked if they could plant a small community garden along the edge of my fence. Another neighbor asked if I'd teach her son how to care for chickens. The farm stopped being the problem. It became part of the neighborhood. That surprised me more than the legal victory. I thought winning would feel like triumph. It felt like healing. The HOA had run on control, on fear, on pretending paperwork mattered more than people. Once that disappeared, what was left was just a group of families who wanted quiet streets and safe homes and something to believe wasn't rigged against them. And I wanted the same thing. They tried to take my home and ended up losing control of their own neighborhood. Not because I was stronger, not because I was louder, but because they built their power on something false. And false things collapse when the truth leans on them long enough. The funny part is, nobody talks about the bank anymore. Nobody talks about the investigation or the fraud or the foreclosure that almost happened. They talk about the block party last summer. The time the goats got loose and wandered into someone's garage. The way the old oak tree lights up at sunset. Life went back to being small, which is what I always wanted. People think power is money. They think it's titles and signatures and logos on letterhead. It isn't. Power is knowing how the system works. Power is not being afraid of it. Power is standing your ground. When someone tells you they own something they don't, the HOA had money, they had lawyers, they had rules, but they didn't have truth, and they didn't have patience. I had both. This farm didn't survive a century because it was valuable. It survived because someone always stood in front of it and said no. No to developers, no to shortcuts, no to people who confuse authority with ownership. That's the part nobody writes into deeds, but it's the part that lasts. And every time I step onto the porch now, I don't see a battlefield anymore. I see a place that held, a place that outweighted a lie, a place that reminded a whole neighborhood that the system isn't something to fear. If you're willing to understand it, and if you're willing to stand your ground long enough for the truth to catch up,